Hey there YouTube, this is JD. I'm back doing another game. I'm actually starting a new series today. I'm going to be looking at the games from Jacob Aagaard's Attacking Manual Volume 1. I decided to mix it up a little bit and not just do IQP positions, so I'm actually going to start doing games from several different books and then just sort of releasing one video each week from each book. So on Saturdays, I'm going to be doing Attacking Manual. So the game today between Hector Karolyi and Johnny Hector, I have no idea if I said that name even remotely close to right, is the first game we're going to take a look at. Let's flip the board here because this game does happen from Black's perspective. The main thing that this game is going to feature is coming from the chapter that Aagaard calls "Bring All Your Toys to the Nursery," which is his clever metaphor for bringing all of your pieces into the attack. So we're going to look at a game where Black very successfully utilizes all of his pieces for his attack. So if we get into the game here, we see that it starts out as a Budapest Gambit. So after this knight f3, this is already a mistake. So any of you guys who play the d4 and you're worried about facing the Budapest, which after you see this game I can see why you might be afraid of it, you can actually avoid any of the problems here. The problem with knight f3, as we'll see in the game, is it allows this bishop c5, and then you have to play e3 to defend your f7 pawn. Which means this light squared bishop, the dark squared bishop is shut in behind this pawn chain. But you can pretty easily avoid that. Instead of playing knight f3, just play bishop f4. And now bishop to c5 is pretty tepid, because you can just play e3 and you've managed to get this bishop out and you're not going to have any real problems. So after like bishop f4, you usually see knight c6. Now you can play knight f3. Bishop b4, you play knight bd2. And your idea here is that you want to avoid the double pawns here. This is very solid. Queen e7, Black is just going to try to get his pawn back. And now e3, just letting out the bishop. He gets his pawn back. You capture this way. Now bishop e2, both sides just castle. And then after d6, just play like knight b3. And the idea is that I'm going to play a3. And when this bishop retreats, I'm going to capture it. And I'll have the bishop pair. And a very solid position. So White's going to have a pretty comfortable but small advantage in this opening playing this way. But when you compare this to how the game went, this is going to be much preferable to what actually happened. So instead of this, we're going to go back and take a look at what actually happened. He played knight f3. Now this is not necessarily like a losing move, but it does create considerable more difficulties. So now bishop c5, which is the right time to do this, otherwise White would still have this opportunity to play bishop f4. He plays e3, and now knight c6. He's going to go after and try to gain his pawn back, which there's not a lot that White can really do to stop that from happening, at least not without severely weakening his position. So bishop to e2 now, and he just captures his pawn. Both sides castle, and then knight c3, and now a5. Which when you see a5, you're probably thinking, oh, he just wants to stop b4 so I can make sure that I get to maintain this bishop on the diagonal, which it does do that. But Black actually has another much more interesting idea in mind. His plan is he's going to lift this rook and try to bring it across to the king side, which if he played something like d6, developed his bishop and then his queen, and tried to bring the rook over this way, that's going to take far more moves to do. So this is going to be a much faster approach. So White just plays b3, which I think is it's a little bit slow, but I guess his idea is he wants to play bishop to b2, as that's probably the best diagonal he's really going to get. But Black plays another instructive move here. He captures on f3, which the point is when we look back, you're seeing we have sort of these doubled knights. The knight is kind of performing the both wanting to occupy the same square. D5 or E5 is clearly the best place for the knight, but both knights can't be there. So he's just going to capture, which removes this defender, which is going to be kind of important later. This knight did a nice job of defending h2, but now h2 is going to come under some fire here relatively quickly. So after the bishop takes back, he then occupies the e5 square with a second knight. Which, notice the other thing that this has done is after he plays this rook lift, the 6th rank is completely clear to bring his rook across. So we get bishop to e4. White doesn't want to give up this bishop for the knight and lose the bishop pair. And so his idea is he's going to play e4, and then he's going to play g3 later, and then the bishop back to g2. Which is quite a slow plan, and with this knight here on e5, that's going to weaken his light squares quite a bit as well, which again is going to factor into the game here. So rook a6, beginning that rook lift that we were talking about. And notice that he has specifically waited to play d6, opening this bishop until he can get this rook to come across here. If he played d6, obviously this rook a6 plan would be pretty fruitless. So going forward, we get g3. White's just continuing on with his plan, which is quite slow. He's going to end up spending 3 tempi getting this bishop back to where he wants it to be, and all the while we see that black is making some pretty serious progress. So he swings the rook all the way across, and now knight to a4, which again is another move I don't really like. He's perhaps hoping to kick this bishop off of this diagonal, but he's just going to drop back to a7, which is another advantage of having played this a5 move, as he freed up this square for the bishop to safely stay on this really nice diagonal, where it's going to create some good pressure against the king. So it just continues on with the plan of bishop d2, and then d6 now. Only after he has completed his rook transfer does he open up this bishop. And then after queen e2, the idea is he sees that he's going to have some real pressure against h2 after queen g5 and then across to h5. And so he puts the queen on e2 with the idea that he can maybe later play f3 and bring the bishop back to h1, and then the queen is going to guard here. I suppose he didn't want to play something like e4, which opens this bishop to attack the rook here, because that's going to open this bishop up and have some real pressure directly against the f2 square with the queen right behind it. Perhaps he just didn't want to do that, or he didn't want to shut in his own light squared bishop, which perhaps somewhat restricts the bishop here on c8 from being able to develop because of this pawn, which of course black doesn't want to play b6 because that would just shut this bishop out completely. So excuse me, after rook e8, which is a move that Aagaard praises a lot. It would be really tempting, I think, for a lot of us just to immediately play queen to g5 and start trying to get pressure on this h-file here. After something along the lines of trying to block this queen, maybe you're going to play knight g4 or something like that to try to get attacking here. But black takes the time to make sure that he's developing all of his pieces, including everything in the attack. So already after rook e8, we've got both rooks which are attacking the king side on e3 and then h2. Both bishops are already hitting some key squares here. Here it's the e3 and f2, and then h3, which may be able to come in and trade off this light squared bishop, after which point the knight will be able to safely jump into f3 or g4 later and really create lots of problems here. In the meantime, white has stuck this knight over here on a4. He hasn't done anything with this bishop or this rook. So he's got a considerable loss of time through moves like knight a4 and this lengthy maneuvering of fianchettoing the bishop. Instead, he should have spent some time trying to develop here. So we get to f3, just continuing with his plan of going to put the bishop back on h1. But we sort of have to wonder, if he came up with this idea of playing bishop to h1, why he didn't do it in the first place. Instead of going back to g2, because he's going to spend yet another tempi playing around with this light squared bishop. The other problem with f3 is that it creates some real tension here on e3, which is now weakened. And not just e3, but actually this entire diagonal, he has some real problems. It already looks quite bad. We're not sure what's going to happen, but it's starting to look pretty seriously bad for white here. So of course, after f3, he brings the queen up to g4, and just planning to come across to g5. Note here that f4, not a problem. If he just plays f4, we get something simple like queen to g4. I mean, of course he can't trade queens, because if I trade queens, I'm going to go knight g4. I'm hitting this pawn, and you're going to lose one of them for sure. So instead that, maybe he plays rook e1, because the queen is unprotected after all. But then we just trade queens. And after rook takes, then you can throw the bishop out to g4. Going to kick this rook back, because he needs to maintain control of this e3 point. And so if the if the rook just drops back, then we get knight to d3. And the rook is forced off of defending this e-pawn. He can even just capture the bishop, which is the defender. And it's clear he's going to be dropping at least a pawn. So I really don't think that f4 is any sort of a suitable threat here. So instead of that, he chooses to play... let me go back. Lost my line there. Instead of f4, he played knight to c3. Which again, we see that he's just wasted time with this knight a4 maneuver, and he's actually lost at this point. The game is already over. He's not going to be able to deal with the threats that are coming his way. Maybe something like bishop to d2, which is what Aagaard suggests, but he says that after queen h5 and then h4, black maybe even has ideas of playing f5, f4, and he's going to continue to be able to break through and create some real problems, and it doesn't seem like white's probably going to be able to hold anyway. But knight c3 just sort of seals the deal for him. So he plays queen to h5, which of course is threatening to take this pawn. So of course he plays bishop back to h1. He could play h4, but that just looks way too weakening. This pawn is now weak. Really all three of the pawns are pretty weak. But this allows a final combination, which we don't actually get to see, because after he plays the move, white just resigns immediately. He plays knight takes c4, which can't be captured, as we'll see. If he takes it, then we just get the fantastic rook takes. Which the problem with that is the queen must stay in contact with h2, otherwise it's just mate. So if he tries to take here, we're just going to take with the bishop. Which, if he plays the king up now to g2, then queen h3 is just mate. If he blocks with the rook, we just mate on h2 now. Or sorry, it's not actually mate on h2. We're going to take an extra move here and mate from h1. But notice that the rook was penned, so it couldn't attack the queen. So that doesn't work at all. Obviously, he can't take with the queen, because we're just going to capture there. So this line is just impossible for him. And so if he can't take the knight, and then what can he really do? I mean, he could play maybe something like knight d1, just trying to guard the d1, trying to guard the e3 square, but that doesn't work either, because we just go ahead and capture the pawn, and he really can't take back, because he's going to have the same problems as before. Note he's only got two real defenders of e3, because the queen is not a defender. So he's just down two pawns, and has absolutely done nothing to soften up black's attack. Black's attack is still completely raging on, and so he just chose to resign rather than suffer on here. I don't really want to look too much at all of the different variations where white could have tried to improve earlier on, because I don't think that's so important. Rather than look at lots of variations, I think that the key takeaway is just looking at the way that black managed to bring every piece he had to concentrate it on the king side. And once he had done that, it became tremendously difficult for white to try to find ways to counter all of the piece activity that black had generated. With perfect play, he might have been able to do something earlier on, but your opponents aren't going to play perfectly. And when you put them under this kind of a pressure, they're going to make mistakes, and your activity is going to be able to push through and win a lot of games. So anyway, I hope that you think that this game was interesting, and remember, if you play the d4 side of this on the white pieces, you can avoid all of it. just play bishop f4 instead of knight f3, and you're going to follow down the lines that we looked at, and you're going to be a-okay. There's some tricky stuff that black can try, but it's all going to work out in white's favor for sure. So make sure you subscribe, leave me a comment, and I'll catch you guys later. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.